As Libyans mark the anniversary of the uprising that led to the overthrow of Colonel Muammar Gaddafi after his rule of more than 40 years, questions still remain. What are the challenges ahead for Libyans? And how can the Libyan government end the armed militias' control of the streets? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Adrian Finnegan. Libyans are celebrating the first anniversary of their uprising against Muammar Gaddafi. In less than a year, they were able to topple and then to kill the former leader, all with the help of NATO forces. But many challenges still remain for the country, one of which is tracking down remnants of the old regime. The Libyan National Transitional Council is pressing countries to hand over leading figures from Gaddafi's government. It says they were involved in crimes and should be returned to the country to face trial. But rights groups say that some of those currently being held in makeshift prisons are being mistreated. Tony Bertley has this special report from Misrata on the thousands of pro-Gaddafi fighters being held without trial.
They sit in a kind of legal limbo, some held over suspected war crimes, others for simply being pro-Gaddafi fighters and supporters. There are thousands of them spread throughout Libya in makeshift prisons, 4 months after the conflict ended, and most have not been charged with any offence. Mansour Ido was a member of Gaddafi's inner circle and was privy to the workings of the regime. He stayed with Gaddafi until the very end in Sirte. He knows who did what in the war.
Gaddafi's sons controlled the war effort. The power wasn't with Gaddafi but with his sons. Mu'tasim, Saif, Khamis, Saadi didn't agree with them. Mohammed was out of the picture and Saif al-Arab was opposed to any spilling of Libyan blood, but he died from NATO bombs.
Saif al-Islam, Gaddafi's oldest son, is the most high-profile of prisoners. He was captured in the desert 3 months ago, and prosecutors have issued hundreds of arrest warrants, including for the remaining members of Gaddafi's family. Around 15 of Gaddafi's top officials are still at large and are being hunted. They were all highly influential and include Abdullah el-Senussi, described as the black box, a man who could shed light on Libya's darkest secrets. As intelligence chief, he would have had access to information about the downing of Pan Am 101, the shooting of British policewoman Yvonne Fletcher, and Libya's link with so-called terrorist groups.
People, they are outlaws, and they are there as long as they are free to move. They're trying to disturb the peace of this country and the peace of the world.
Some pro-Gaddafi people who didn't flee or were captured are learning what defeat really means. Human rights organisations have produced evidence of abuse, torture and killing, the kind of treatment the revolution was intent on ending.
I think it's extremely naive to say revenge. You know, the idea of revenge or the idea that of reconciliation happening is going to be so quick to formulate. I think what we need to do is instead focus on educating people about the benefits of reconciliation and the negatives of revenge.
But the scars of Libya's bitter war may not heal as easily or as quickly as some may hope. Tony Bertley, Al Jazeera, Misrata.
Well, as Libya's ruling National Transitional Council comes closer to finalising plans for the upcoming elections this year, bringing democracy to the country still faces numerous challenges. Let's take a look at some of the tasks that still lie ahead. Well, the biggest challenge for the NTC is ensuring that the elections in June are free and fair, and that Libya's various tribal groups are all integrated into the new parliament. Another major concern is security. Disarming rebels is essential for the NTC, as is bringing various militias under the umbrella of the Ministry of Defence. And as for the economy, the NTC will have to make sure that the nation's oil wealth and unfrozen assets are distributed fairly. In addition to all of this, the NTC will have to create legitimate and trusted institutions. But first, it will have to prove its own legitimacy to the Libyan people. Well, Libya's first draft election law has been the subject of controversy. In response to input from the Libyans, the NTC has now made some changes to the finalised document. They include women could have a higher number of seats in the National Congress, presumably up to 20%. There have been concerns about gender representation in the earlier draft, with just 10% of 20 seats reserved for women. The finalised election law allows Libyans with dual nationality to run for office. The first draft required dual nationals to give up their citizenship. The document also makes room for political parties. Now, under Gaddafi, parties had been banned, and many feared that without formal approval of parties, the election would be hijacked by tribal leaders and wealthy individuals. And finally, the previous draft didn't tackle how the country's voting districts will be divided. But on Monday, the NTC announced the allocations of seats. The West will have 102 seats. The East, including Benghazi, where the anti-Gaddafi uprising began, will have 60. The South will have 29. And the central cities, including Gaddafi's hometown of Sirte, will have 9. So, is Libya better after Gaddafi? What are the challenges ahead for the Libyan people? And how can the Libyan government end the armed group's presence on the streets? Joining us now to answer these questions are our guests today. Here in Doha, Tariq Youssef, a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. In Oxford, Richard Baltrop, an author and analyst of Libyan politics. And from Amman, Donatella Rovera, a senior advisor for crisis response for Amnesty International. Welcome to Inside Story, all of you. Donatella, if we can start with you. First of all, you've just returned from Libya. Tell us what you saw, what you experienced there.
We looked, during the course of our investigation, we looked specifically at issues of human rights abuses by militias. There are several hundred militias who are operating throughout the country without, outside any sort of rule of law, without any authority control. And they do commit widespread abuses, notably the issue of the torture, which is quite routine in the detention centers, officials, semi-officials, or outright illegal, by the various militias as well as other security entities. We also looked at other abuses committed by militia, notably the forcible displacement of population, sort of revenge attacks against individuals, against families, in some cases against entire communities who are chased out of their homes and their homes are burned down to prevent them ever returning. We looked at the issue of whether the National Transitional Council, the NTC, has taken the necessary steps to investigate these abuses, especially that, quite apart from the very recent abuses that I looked at over the last month, similar situations and cases have been brought to their attention over the course of many months. And regrettably, what we have found is that no investigations have been initiated into any of the abuses committed by militias, including very serious abuses that amount to war crimes.
Richard Baltrop, bearing in mind what Donatella has just said, how is the NTC doing? I mean, Libya's situation is pretty unique. There are hardly any benchmarks against which the NTC's performance can be measured, are there?
Its situation is a little bit unique, and the benchmarks against which it may be measured are the benchmarks of the past in Libya, which are very poor benchmarks. The standards of conduct of the security forces during the Gaddafi era were poor. The level of human rights abuses was very high. So the norms in Libya are poor, they're bad norms. And judging Libya now, it's being judged against quite high benchmarks, international benchmarks or norms in human rights, and it's being judged partly at the moment on the understanding that this is the 1-year anniversary of the revolution. On the other hand, it is only barely 4 months since the revolution was completed and liberation was declared.
Richard, I'll come back to that point in a moment, but first let's bring in Tariq Youssef. The interim government, Tariq, largely impotent, unable, perhaps unwilling to rein in fighters, to rebuild institutions or to stop widespread corruption in the country. Are you optimistic about the future for democracy and human rights in Libya?
I'm certainly optimistic with the right time horizon in mind. I think many of us who followed Libya in the past 20 years or so expected that any post-revolution, post-dictatorship scenario will require a lot of work to rebuild state institutions, to rebuild trust between people and the government, and to bring about a rule of law and the cohesion of a nation in a way that Gaddafi had so dismantled and destroyed systematically over 42 years. To do all of that in a post-conflict setting, as has just been noted, I think also makes the job all the more challenging and all the more difficult. So with a 5-year horizon, one can be optimistic, but I'm certainly more pessimistic on the short run, on the immediate term. I think the next year is going to be a pivotal, critical year in Libya's transition. The elections, the post-elections, the first transitional government, restoring legitimacy to authority, having control over the militias. These are two of the important benchmarks that one would hope to see, and if Libya does not pass through these tests, I'm afraid that the immediate term will look all the more pessimistic. And I would say on the ground today, with all the hope and all the optimism of four months ago, there's a sinking feeling of anxiety, trepidation, and a great concern about the future amongst Libyans at large.
Donatella Rovera, while not wishing to play down the horrific nature of what you were telling us about what you'd seen and heard while you were on the ground in Libya, it is fair to say, isn't it, that it's still very early days for Libya, that the NTC does face enormous challenges, that what you've been seeing in Libya is just a part of the transition process from dictatorship to democracy.
Well, certainly, I think, you know, it's absolutely fair to recognize that the NTC faces enormously momentous challenges, precisely because the 42 years before were a period where there was no civil society, where, you know, the justice was not working properly, the level of abuses was very high, there was no freedom. All this understood and taking on board the enormous challenges that the NTC faces, there is nonetheless cause to be concerned about the development, as we see it on the ground, of militias answering to no one, behaving as if they are above the law, because quite frankly, they are above the law. They are not being held accountable at all. Now, it would be absolutely unrealistic to expect that after such a short time, after the NTC has gained control, so to speak, of the country, that they would have been able to put everything right. That would not be realistic as an expectation. However, what is a cause of concern is to see that even very small steps to investigate the abuses and the crimes committed by militia members, by former opposition fighters, that seems to be considered not a priority, because by and large the victims of these attacks, you know, some people, a dozen of cases that I looked at recently, have been tortured to death, for example. 30,000 people from the town of Tawerga have been displaced and every single house has been burned down. People in detention center are, tortured on a daily basis. Now, all of these things seem not to be considered as a priority, because the targets of these attacks are, by and large, people who are considered to be, whether rightly or wrongly, I don't know, but in any case, they are considered to be people who have supported or worked in any capacity with the previous regime. Now, the fact that this is not considered a priority, the fact that these abuses are not investigated, is leading the armed militias to feel that they have, a blank check, that they have impunity, and that they can continue to commit violation.
Okay.
And what I've seen as a further development is that, for example, detainees I've seen in detention who are not accused of, security offences, who are simply there for common law offences such as drinking or stealing, they too are being tortured. Why? Quite simply because the militias who are holding them feel that they can, because nobody's holding them to account.
Okay, Donatella. Richard Bartrop, why has the NTC failed to put into place mechanisms to prevent the sort of post-conflict violence that Donatella was talking about there? Why has it failed to make the difficult decisions that are required, and how does it bring in the various Libyan militias to the legal framework to stop them operating with impunity?
there are a number of very interesting points here. As Donatella was indicating, the NTC really could have done more, and I think it's a cause for regret that it hasn't or done more to show its commitment to meeting some standards on human rights. And is there a problem in the NTC, and why has it not managed to show a commitment and meet some standards? One difficulty for the NTC is perhaps the history of decision-making in Libya. During the 42 years of the Gaddafi era, decision-making was centralised in Gaddafi and, to a lesser extent, members of his family. And the Libyan executive below that was very disempowered, and now the NTC and officials and the civil service around it have to learn to take decisions more rapidly themselves and learn to carry the responsibility for those decisions, which for 42 years they didn't. Responsibility could be passed on up to Colonel Gaddafi.
Tariq Youssef, to what extent is the NTC a part of the problem? Are they an asset or a liability?
I think 4 months ago the NTC was Libya's revolution's biggest asset. I would suggest at the moment that they may have in fact become one of the liabilities of the revolution at the moment. The NTC, by not being able to reinvent itself, adjust to the reality of a post-revolution or a post-conflict condition, take precisely some of the very steps that my colleagues have suggested now, display and show leadership and decisiveness in the face of some clear dangers and threats to the legitimacy of the revolutions, and by not being able to fulfill some of the basic aspirations and hopes of Libyans in the past 12 months, has in fact rendered itself as a body one that lacks credibility, that doesn't have the standing not just with the militias, but I would argue with the larger public. The NTC now needs to either reinvent itself or accelerate the timeline of the political process to produce, hopefully, a legitimate government, a legitimate elected body, one that can engage in the national dialogue that is needed to help bring about reconciliation, bring about peace and prosperity, restoring the institutions of the country and starting the long journey of building institutions in a country where 42 years have left it with very little to build on. And precisely as my colleagues have suggested, norms and public policies and discourses and practices that support centralization, support cronyism, support regionalism, corruption, many things that I would say the Libya revolution was very much against, and it was for those reasons that the revolution came about and was so sweeping in its form and so high and aspiring in what it wanted to achieve.
Donatella Rivera, the situation in Libya, of course, was brought about with outside help. What can or should Libya's allies be doing now to bring about a halt to the human rights abuses that you've been telling us about?
Well, certainly those members of the international community who have been close partners of the NTC and who have continued to have good relations should convey a very clear and unequivocal message that this kind of lawlessness, this kind of impunity for those who continue to commit revenge attacks is not acceptable, and that unless measures are taken by the NTC, the situation will not improve. So that message must be conveyed very, very strongly. Secondly, the NTC has indicated that their proposal to solve the problem of the hundreds of militias who are operating within the country is to integrate members of militias into security forces, the army, the police, other kinds of security forces. Now, again, in order to do that and to create accountable, responsible, disciplined and effective forces, it is absolutely necessary that they put in place a very robust screening process to ensure that those members of militias who have been responsible for serious human rights abuses, including committing war crimes in the past are excluded and are not put in a position of authority within security forces where they would be in a position to continue to commit those abuses. It is equally important that the members of the international communities who have already offered to train the new Libyan security forces and army put themselves their own mechanism, their own sort of screening and checking mechanisms to ensure that those who are put forward for training are people who are fit for that purpose and not people who've committed serious crimes.
All right, Donatella, sorry to cut you short. Time is tight here. Richard Baltrop, to what extent is the NTC's apparent inability or reluctance to put in place measures to reel in the militias, to stop the corruption, to rebuild institutions, merely serving to make the challenges for a democratically elected government even harder after the elections in June?
The challenges are hard, and the slow action by the NTC during the past 4 months is tending to make the challenges even harder still. Obviously, the NTC starts with a handicap, and Libya is at a handicap compared with Tunisia and Egypt. The lack of a history of semi-democratic, even semi-democratic institutions puts Libya at a handicap. What it does about the security forces is critical. It can do more. On the other hand, one shouldn't be idealistic about what it can achieve in demobilization and integration of armed forces. What can be said on paper can look very good. Actually implementing disarmament is very difficult. What Donatella suggested about international members of the international community that offer training for Libyan armed forces, that I agree with. They can try and encourage the introduction of standards. That's a good measure.
Tarek Youssef, Libya, of course, has gone from a country where one man held all the power to where power is now, or at least seems to be, in hundreds of different pairs of hands, each taking its own decisions. To what extent would you describe what's happening in Libya now, perhaps as a counter-revolution? And is it too early? Is it just too soon for national reconciliation?
I think it might be too soon, but we need to start somewhere. And I would sort of characterize the problems with the NTC and the interim government at the moment as being problems that have to do with a crisis in leadership and credibility vis-a-vis the public. Until that is resolved, it will be very difficult for the NTC and the government to make pronouncements that the public takes at face value or to execute on the ground. I think we need a clean break with the past, and that implies that Libya's sweeping revolution needs to raise the benchmarks for what constitutes effective, successful, or worthy of support by the Libyan people. We need to break with past practices. There is a counter-revolution at the moment, and I would say that worries me a lot more than the militias. It's the counter-revolution led by the cronies of the old regime, the benefactors of the old regime, and many of those who operated and benefited economically and financially. They're the ones who, in many ways, are making it difficult not just for the NTC, but for the interim government to execute on the ground on promises that they make vis-a-vis the Libyan public and with the outside world. That is where the work needs to start, and that is where I would say accelerating the political process whereby you have elected governments and you let the Libyan people vote for whom they want to lead them in the future will give you the legitimacy and precisely the space to engage in a very ambitious and a very effective and a very credible process of nation building, reconciliation, and holding those to account who've committed violations of international law or crimes against humanity.
And that, I'm afraid, is where we must leave it for this edition of Inside Story. We're out of time. Thanks to Tarek Youssef, Richard Baltrop, and Donatella Rivera. And thank you very much indeed for joining us on this edition of the programme. If you want to send us your feedback, email your thoughts to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. Thanks for watching. In Doha, I'm Adrian Finnegan. I'll see you again. Bye for now.